Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to talk about books that span decades of time. And I had a long chat with Alan about how I was going to refer to these books, because initially I wanted to call them generational fantasy books. But I'm not sure that that completely sums up all of the books that I'm going to talk about. Some of them certainly are generational stories where you see families as, people grow up to have children. You see those various generations of people and how they interact with each other. But some of them are just books that span, a decade or a few decades. And I felt like the term generational didn't really fit as well. The conclusion that I've come to is that there's not a great way to refer to these, so I'm just going to call them decades spanning fantasy. This is a video about fantasy stories that take place over a long period of time. And this is not a concept that I gave a lot of thought to prior to last year. I think I had always known that I liked seeing how people change over time. As someone who is a character-driven reader, I really like to see how people change or how they don't, which is pretty common both in fiction and in life. And what the repercussions might be for the story. However, there was one series, and it's the first series that I'm going to talk about, that really kicked off my thoughts about this and made me recognize that this is something that I really, really like in fantasy. And that series was The Long Price Quartet by Daniel Abraham. So The Long Price Quartet, as you would guess, is a series of 4 books written by Daniel Abraham. And the unique thing about this series is that we follow 2 main characters. Their names are Ota and Mati, but we follow them over their lifespan. And each book is a pretty self-contained story about them at a particular age. So we follow them as like late adolescents / young adults, then as adults, then middle age, and then elderly people. So we get to see them throughout these different phases of their life, how their age affects what they're able to do, how they interact with the world, the growth that they show, or the stagnation that subsists, across the lifespan. And it's really, really fascinating. I didn't give a lot of thought to this before reading The Long Price Quartet. And when I read it, it was so unlike any other fantasy story that I had ever consumed before that it was all I could think about. And it's still all I can think about. I think about The Long Price Quartet all the time. I think about the characters. I think about the way that Daniel Abraham crafted that story. And I just love it. I think it will always be one of my favorite series. It will certainly always be one of the most unique fantasy series that I ever read. And it really got me thinking about other series that I like that do similar things. I think what makes Long Price Quartet such a standout in this kind of particular subset of fantasy books is that, number one, Daniel Abraham does such a phenomenal job of writing these characters at all these different points in their lives. And we talk a lot on BookTube and in general about authentic characters and what it means for authors to bring that authenticity and what we want to see from the characters that we read about. We want to see people who are having real world struggles, that are processing emotions, that react in ways that feel true to the way that people would act or react in the real world. And then we kind of like superimpose that all in a fantasy setting, add in some magic just for chaos, and then we like the results. But Daniel Abraham has crafted 2 characters that feel real in all of the toughest, most desperate sense of the word. These characters are not just there to show some sort of character growth or to convey a message. It's almost like he's writing about real people because the mistakes that they make follow them through their lifespan. Those mistakes dictate the choices that they have, and the circumstances that they end up in are often as a direct result of what they have done. And just seeing the care that he put into these characters at each phase of their life. This is certainly a series that you could read when you are a young adult, when you are middle-aged, when you are at, near the end of your life, and you could get totally different things out of it, and you could empathize with the characters in such different ways. And it is stunning. It is a feat of writing in general, and it is very, very underrated as a fantasy series. It is not going to appeal to everyone, but I think if you are interested in a story that follows characters over their lifespan, through generations, seeing how they change and how things shift, then The Long Price Quartet absolutely has to be on your list. And it is, I think, the most successful novel in doing this that I have ever read. To flip things like totally in a different direction and look at the idea of a decades spanning novel that is almost nothing like The Long Price Quartet, but still does what it sets out to accomplish very, very well, is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. And I know that nobody needs me to tell them what The Dresden Files is about. Nobody needs to hear more recommendations for The Dresden Files. I'm not going to talk about why you should or shouldn't read the series. What I'm going to talk about is how much the time scale of this series helped me appreciate it. For anyone who has not followed along on my Dresden journey on this channel, I started off as someone who didn't like Dresden Files. I DNF'd the first book 15 years ago, picked it back up because of BookTube. I was lukewarm on the first couple. I thought the next few were fine. And then I fell in love with the series, binged through the second half of the series so quickly. It has risen to be one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. And I think a big part of that is just because of the timeline of the story. We follow Harry Dresden, our main character, from book 1 right to the end of the series, and there's approximately a year between each book. There are a couple of the books that go directly back to back, where the next one picks up right after the previous one left off, which gives us a time scale of about 15-ish years of Harry Dresden's life. And he starts off in his mid-20s, in the first book, so we get to see him as he navigates kind of young adulthood, being out on his own into adulthood. And it's fascinating. It really, at least in my case, it really made me feel for Harry. It really brought Harry to life. Watching how he changes with each year, watching how he reconciles the events that have happened to him, how the consequences of previous books become part of his character. And Jim Butcher is really good at this. He is good at taking the struggles that Harry has lived through and integrating them into his character and making them part of his personality, making them have real repercussions on Harry's psyche or on Harry's actions. Harry might do something in a book that has a consequence, and then he will think about that in books that are further down the line and think, this is not an option for me because I'm not willing to let that happen again. I already made that mistake. Or we'll see Harry repeating the same mistakes in a way that is intensely frustrating, but very realistic. And I think that kind of endears him to you as well, because you can see the humanity that comes out in Harry Dresden as you make your way through the books. So I also really, really like this, even in a lot of the longer fantasy series that I have read. And I guess the longest ones that I have read are probably the Sword of Truth series, which does not cover a huge period of time. I haven't read Wheel of Time, but I don't think that takes place over a super long time period. I think all of the books pretty much pick up where the last one left off. So even the really, really long fantasy series that we have, kind of those quintessential long fantasy series, they don't do the same thing as the Dresden Files, where you get these big gaps of time and you get to see someone as they live their life, essentially. You get to see them throughout the different stages of adulthood. And that's really interesting. And I think part of what appeals to me, and probably why I didn't think about this before, is that I am also older now. When I read the bulk of my early fantasy, I was a teenager, I was a kid. I didn't think about aging because it was not something that ever occurred to me. And the older you get, the more you think about that, and the more you reflect on your life and, wonder if you have made the right choices and hope that you are learning from the decisions that you make. And so watching a fantasy character live out that journey is really satisfying. And it certainly made me feel for Harry. It made him a favorite character for me. He feels very real. I am emotionally attached to Harry and to other characters in the series. We see some characters who started off as kids, little children at the beginning of the series, and now we see them into adulthood. And it can be hard for us to reconcile this adult character with this child that we saw at the beginning of the series. And so I think then sometimes that also lets us know how Harry or some of the secondary characters are also feeling, because they have also watched these individuals grow up. So it feels like a very immersive experience when you follow a character like this. And I think that that is a big part of what drew me into the Dresden Files. I think that that is a big part of what made it stand out to me and what made me enjoy it so very much. So that is another book that I would recommend that spans this kind of long period of time. The third one I'm going to talk about, also intensely popular on BookTube, is the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. So this one's interesting because there's not a lot of time jump in the first book. The first book is a fairly contained story. It's been a couple years since I read it, but I believe it takes place just over a couple of months in book one. There may be a time jump near the end of the book, but I'm not 100% sure. But I think the first one is just like a series of months. Then we get into book two, which I think picks up like fairly closely to where book one left off, but we do get a couple of time skips in book two. We skip like periods of a couple of years or 5 years, and we get to see where the characters are in their lives at that time. And then in the third book of the trilogy, which is called Jade Legacy, we see these giant time jumps. And I think by the time everything is said and done, there must have been like 40 years between book one and the end of book three. I'm not the like most hardcore Greenbone fan, so I don't know. This is not a series that I went and like read up on and read like a bunch of fan theories and all those kinds of things. So if you are a huge Greenbone fan and you know the exact time scale, like the time frame between the beginning of book one and the end of book three, please write it down below because then people will know what that is. But regardless of how many exact years it is, we do see generations of the families in this story, which I think works really well for a story like the Greenbone Saga because this is a family story. It is about family pride, family business, what it means to be a family, what your legacy is, how you build a legacy, how you hold on to it. Is it worth holding on to? What should you do with what you were given? Like, how much do you owe to the people who came before you? And should you be following in their footsteps or should you be carving a new path for yourself? Those are all really big questions in this series. And so having this take place over, many decades helps frame that narrative. It helps bring that story to life. And to be honest, for me, it saved the Greenbone Saga. So I was someone who thought that the first book, Jade City, was okay. Then when I read the second book, Jade War, I thought, am I even going to finish this series? It was just not working for me. And I couldn't understand why, because I liked the setup. I thought that the premise was really intriguing. It had all the things that I thought that I would really love. But there was a disconnect between me and the characters. I just couldn't feel anything for them. I didn't care what happened to them. I didn't feel the tension during the fight scenes because it didn't really matter to me if someone made it through or didn't make it through. And then when the third book came out and everyone had loved it, and then they mentioned the scale of the story, because I had had such a good time with Long Price Quartet, I thought, you know what? I'm going to give Jade Legacy a chance. And I loved it. It was a 5-star read for me. It totally brought back the Greenbone Saga for me. And now I really want to go back and reread the series, reread books 1 and 2, having the knowledge that I do about the characters and the direction that their lives take and what happens and how the choices that they make in those early books have long-reaching consequences that make it all the way to the end of this series. And I really want to do that because I think that I will feel a lot more invested in the characters in that way. But I think for stories like this that are so family-centric, that are focused on a group of people, watching how the way that they interact changes, watching how their family structure changes, watching how the way that they present themselves to the world, the way that they want to be viewed, seeing how that changes with time and seeing how different characters' perspectives change depending on the phase of life that they're in. Are they young and hot-blooded and feeling immortal, or are they older and more contemplative and wondering about the choices that they've made and how that's affected their lives? That's a huge contrast, and it creates a lot of dissonance in the character, and that's super interesting to think about and to explore. So really, really like what Fonda Lee did with the Greenbone Saga as well. And if you like that idea of following a family through time and seeing how those dynamics shift, then I would absolutely recommend the Greenbone Saga. my very first experience with a story that did something like this, where we followed different generations or where we left off in one book and picked up like many decades later, is actually The Lord of the Rings. And I guess I'll call this like the Tolkien legendarium, or Tolkien's huge expanse of Middle-earth related works. This is a story that I think it didn't automatically come to mind when I was thinking of putting this video together, but then the longer that I thought about this topic and the longer I thought about these types of books, I thought, the first time that this ever happened to me was when I went from reading The Hobbit with my dad as a little kid and then reading The Lord of the Rings on my own for the first time. And I actually had the opposite response. So I hated it. I was furious when I picked up The Lord of the Rings for the first time and I was not following Bilbo. Bilbo had captured my heart as a little kid. I loved Bilbo, and I thought that The Lord of the Rings was going to be about him and about his journey with the ring, and we were going to follow Bilbo. And Bilbo was the character that I loved, and I didn't want to start to like anybody else. I didn't want to follow anybody else, and I didn't want to fall in love with any other character. I was a very stubborn little child, but eventually I did get around to reading The Lord of the Rings, and I really loved it. And as I read more broadly, it took me a couple of years after finishing The Lord of the Rings before I was ready to read the Silmarillion, and then reading around in some of those adjacent works like Unfinished Tales, Lost Tales, all of those types of stories, seeing what Tolkien has built and watching not just generations now, but ages. And this is why I guess they're not all just intergenerational, but this is a story that spans ages of the world, ages of the earth. And that in itself is a huge accomplishment. And I think that that earns Tolkien his spot on this list. He has done, and this is why The Lord of the Rings has had such far-reaching influence on the genre as a whole, but he, because of his areas of interest and the care and the love that he put into this story, he has done something that very few fantasy authors have also accomplished, and it is intensely satisfying to see a world be built up, to follow a world from its conception and creation, to follow the figures in mythology, all the way up to people who are living in the present age of this world. So it is not the same kind of story as any of the previous ones that I have mentioned, but I think that The Lord of the Rings certainly deserves its spot on this list, and it is the kind of story that brings about that immense satisfaction. So I had to put Tolkien on the list as well. And the very last book that I have on here is actually not a fantasy book. It is a science fiction novel, and it has some of the most interesting world building and the most interesting use of time that I have seen in a book that I have read. And that is the book Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So before I go into the explanation of this, these are all time-stamped. And I think if you want to go into Children of Time knowing absolutely nothing about it, then you can just skip over this one, because the back of the book, the explanation of the story, doesn't give you a whole lot, but I think that there are things about the story that are just common knowledge on the internet, on BookTube and bookish circles, that I don't view as spoilers. I'm not going to give any plot details, any resolution details, but if you are lucky enough to not know anything about Children of Time, then feel free to skip over this and just know that it plays with timelines and follows various generations in a very interesting and unique way, and it makes it one of the best modern science fiction novels that I have ever read. For anyone who is not extremely spoiler sensitive, I will talk a little bit about what I liked about this timeline jumping so much. So for anyone who is still here, this is a story that follows a group of sentient spiders on a planet. So essentially what happens at the beginning of the book is that humanity is kind of seeking out into the universe, and they have put out I think it's a virus. Like they inject a virus into a monkey to send out to a planet because they want to make humanity evolve at a more, at a sped up timeline. Like they want the scale to be much shorter. They are concerned for the state of things on Earth. They're unsure about the future of humanity. So they send out this monkey that is kind of pre-prepared with a DNA soup that is going to make him evolve at a rapid rate. And something goes wrong with the experiment, and instead of a race of humanoid creatures, we get a race of arachnids. So somehow the arachnids get injected with this hyper evolutionary soup and they start to evolve at a very rapid rate. And so we follow, during this story, we kind of have a dual perspective. We follow a group of humans, and then we also follow the perspective of the spiders. And what Adrian Tchaikovsky does with the spiders is so fascinating. He shows us generations of this species as they are evolving, the changes that happen, how their evolution and how their actions and how they have evolved influences future generations. So we see this kind of idea of evolution on this super sped up scale. And I have never read anything like it. I think that it was amazing, and it is so fascinating to watch the jumping between generations. And I think that it deserves a spot on this list. It is nothing like the other books. It is not a decade-spanning story in the same sense as those other novels, but just watching the way that these generations of arachnids change and morph and become the species that they are kind of destined to be is so fascinating. I love Adrian Tchaikovsky's brain. It amazes me how he comes up with these concepts, and then the way that he executes them and the way that he explores these ideas, just top notch. I could not recommend this one highly enough. I thought it was so cool. And even though it's very distinct from these other kinds of decade-sweeping fantasy novels, I think that is still very much worth reading. And I think that it does earn its spot on this list because it does jump between those years just in a very unique way. But that's it. Those are all of the books that made it onto this list, of decade-spanning novels. I would love to have recommendations from all of you. If you have books that you've read that have these kind of protracted timelines where we either follow one character over a very long period of time and watch them change and grow, or we follow a cast of characters where we go from parents to children to grandchildren and watching how that unfolds, I would love to have all of your recommendations for your favorite books, fantasy or otherwise, that fit into this, I'm not going to call it a trope, but this concept. And if you've read any of these and have enjoyed them for this reason, then you can also let me know that. But that's it for today, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!